Good evening all, and welcome to the Church of Mort. Before we begin with our ritual, I do have a few stories to share from unfortunate souls who did not take our privacy warning very seriously. Remember, everything you see in the cult stays in the cult. So, get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I became a driver by coincidence, or so I thought at first. Initially, I was working as a maintenance manager at a house owned by a very wealthy family. One day, while carrying out my usual duties, I was summoned to the boss's office. Upon entering, he greeted me enthusiastically and proposed I become his personal driver, saying that it paid additional salary. After thinking it over, I asked my wife and accepted the offer, knowing that the previous driver enjoyed a good salary and a comfortable life. Although everything seemed normal at first, I soon began to spend less time with my family, as the job would sometimes require me to stay overnight at my boss's house. The situation took an unexpected turn when he proposed that I accompany him on a business trip out of town that would last 12 days. After discussing it with my wife, I accepted, motivated by the generous compensation and the promise of a full week off upon return. However, before we left, the boss gave me a serious and firm warning. He said whatever happened on the trip had to stay on the trip, and that anything I witnessed was not to be disclosed. Although I took it as a threat, I saw it as a precaution against possible compromising situations during the trip, as he held political aspirations. So, on the day of the trip, I drove around 8 to 9 hours to reach the town on the edge of the Sierra. Once there, we began to ascend the foothills, and I simply followed the boss. More than once, it seemed like we were backtracking through the same path among trees and mountains, completely losing any sense of direction. Finally, we arrived to cabins in the middle of the Sierra, a remote location with no cell signal. Before getting out the truck, my boss stopped me and asked for my cell phone, explaining that devices capable of taking pictures or videos were not allowed and that everything was to be kept secret. Although I felt uncomfortable, he was the boss. I had to comply. After handing over the phone, he smiled at me and told me not to worry and to enjoy the trip. Upon arrival, I found that the cabins were divided into a main cabin, luxurious, and large and secondary cabins for drivers and cooks. In the cabin assigned to me, I shared a room with 7 other people, without television signal. They had a selection of DVDs for us. I realized that some people were not on their first trip and were accustomed to this routine. When I got bored, I would leave the cabin and explore the surroundings. I found a place full of ashes, apparently used for bonfires, and when I returned from my exploration, the sun was already setting. I was told to go pick up my dinner, and although I wasn't used to eating at that hour, I did receive it but didn't eat it, leaving the plate beside my bed. It was something that I could eat cold anyway, so I didn't matter. It was later when I felt hungry. I noticed there were no utensils on my plate. I intended to go to the dining room to look for some, but then one of the people there stood up and stopped me and asked where I was going. I explained that I was going to the dining room to get utensils, and he told me I shouldn't go out because it was late. He offered me some he had, so I went back to the table and had my dinner. And when everyone was asleep, I didn't feel that tired, so I went out for a walk. As I approached the door, I was stopped by the same chap, who asked where I was going. I told him I was going for a walk and a smoke, but he forbade me from going out again, saying it was too late. His tone annoyed me, and I decided to open the door, but he stopped me, and he gave me some advice, explaining that the bosses do not tolerate those who snoop and gossip, and warned me about potential serious trouble, and he sounded so convincing that I just shut the door and went to bed. But I couldn't fall asleep. I began to hear strange noises coming from the main cabin. It almost sounded like they were in church. When their singing echoed into the night, an inevitable chill ran through my body. Then, one of the people in the cabin got up and went to the window to look, but was stopped by the same man, who told him the same thing he told me, but the other seemed reluctant to listen and they began to argue. I still pretended to be asleep. As the song echoed through the night, I woke up as the food handlers were preparing for their tasks. I heard their whispers about what had happened the night before, mentioning those strange songs and disconcerting screams. One nodded, and the other seemed too afraid to speak ill of the bosses. Getting up for breakfast, I expected someone to mention what had happened, but no one said anything. Going back to the cabin, I noticed the man who stopped me and the other chap were no longer there. I decided to ask one of the people if they had also heard what happened the night before. And later, when I went out to the courtyard, I saw him returning from the main cabin. The whole scenario was making me feel uncomfortable, but I felt obligated to endure it as I needed the job. All I was hoping for was for the days to pass as quickly as possible, and to keep myself busy, I decided to go to a body of water that was around a 5-minute walk behind the hill. Walking there from the distance, I could make out the imposing statue of a man with a goat's head and huge horns, and one hand pointing up and the other down. That's when I felt someone grab my shoulder. When I turned around, it was the same guy, warning me that this was the second warning he was giving me, and that there would not be a third, emphasizing that I should mind my own business for my own good. Scared and stuttering, I explained that I was just walking and was impressed by the beauty on the hill and the cabin. He smiled ironically and told me he knew exactly what I was doing, warning me of the consequences if he caught me a third time looking at or doing things I should not be doing. Stunned, I lowered my head and returned to the cabin. Later, one of the cooks approached me, trying to make conversation, and suddenly asked what I saw when I went to the river, mentioning that the guy was upset with me. I made up an answer. In the following days, I preferred not to leave the cabin, only doing so to eat. Some nights later, the songs and chanting resonated again, and that time I was so scared I couldn't sleep. At some point in the early hours, screams could be heard from the cabin. I could have sworn they were hurting someone, although it could have all been in my imagination, as I never saw a thing. The following days were the same, and the last night on the hill was the most disturbing. Their singing had a more harrowed tone, the screams more sharp and intense, and although I couldn't see what was happening, the atmosphere was charged with a disturbing energy. Sleep became impossible, and I eagerly awaited the morning to leave that gloomy place. When the day finally came, I was allowed to approach the main cabin to load my employer's luggage. I don't know why, but as I approached, an uncomfortable and fearful feeling overwhelmed me, but I had to help the boss with his luggage. Upon entering the main cabin, involuntarily, I looked up on the second floor, and I could see the same statue that I had seen when I went to the river, which this time had bloodstains on it. I quickly loaded the luggage and left. We returned to the vehicle, got in, and I began the trip back to the city. Halfway through, my boss asked if I had been snooping. At the question, I got nervous, and he told me he was aware of my curiosity, adding that it was fine, expected even, but warned me that if I disclosed anything seen during the trip, it would not end well for my family and I. However, if I kept the secret and behaved, there would be rewards for me and my family. So, as you can imagine, I said nothing. A year passed, the meeting was repeated, and the second time, I didn't do a thing. But another year later, the boss notified me that we would not be going to the meeting that year because it would not be taking place. But some of the members would be attending his house, and I had to take his wife and daughters to the airport, since they would not be present when the guests arrived. The boss also told me that my presence wasn't necessary, and that if I wanted, I could take a few days off, and I took him up on that offer. I used the opportunity to spend quality time with my family. I knew when the boss's guests were supposed to leave, so wanting to be there in case something was needed, I decided to present myself to the house in the early hours before the guests left in the morning. As I was arriving, I saw a garbage truck that didn't belong to our neighborhood inside the property. It seemed odd, so I got a bit closer to investigate. I parked near the truck and got out to talk to the garbage crew to see what they were doing. Just as I was getting close, I realized from the back of the house they were taking out what appeared to be bodies, wrapped in black bags and throwing them in the truck. I was petrified by the shock. Then my cell phone rang. It was my boss. Don't worry. One way or another they weren't going to wake up. We gave them a purpose. With that, he hung up. And when I turned around, my boss was standing 100 yards away, looking at me. 8 months later, my boss was kidnapped by an organized crime ring. They never released him alive, and that was my way out. My name is Joaquin. I'm 25 years old and live in Rosario, in a neighborhood close to a forest known as Bosque de los Constituyentes, located in the northwest area of my city. It's got a bit of a safety issue here, which is why I don't really go out much. I generally just stick to my studies, as I'm in my last year of law school. But I do get a bit lonely sometimes, and that's what prompted me to download Tinder, to see if I could meet someone interesting. One night at around 9 p.m, I matched with a girl who only had a few pictures on her profile. They seemed old as they were blurry and somewhat pixelated, but I set that aside. We started chatting. Her name was Joanna. She was 23, and it appeared that she lived in the nearby neighborhood. I liked her because she was very talkative, but at the same time it was strange, because it seemed like she had nothing else to do but to talk to me. And when I didn't send a reply quick enough, she sent me messages insisting I get back to her. It was a Saturday evening when I suggested we finally meet up. She said she was busy until 10 and that she would be finishing work at a nearby supermarket. Now, as I mentioned, my area isn't exactly super safe, so I was quite wary. I didn't want to end up inviting a stranger to my place, so I asked if we could meet elsewhere. She said her place wasn't an option and suggested somewhere else. When I asked where, she said the forest. I declined, saying that it closed at 6 p.m, but she insisted, saying she knew a way in and that it would be quieter and more private, if you get what I mean, and to meet there at 1 a.m. offering to send instructions on how to enter later. I suggested it would be better if we entered together, but she replied a while later saying she would go ahead and check if there were people around or if the terrain was bad, explaining that sometimes people stay in the forest at night, if you get what I mean. This seemed a bit odd to me though. I thought about saying no, or making up an excuse to avoid going, as I really didn't like the place, despite never having actually visited it, neither by day or by night, even though I lived so close. But as the night approached, I got nervous, and thought maybe it wasn't such a good idea to meet there. She insisted so much that I ended up giving in. It was 1:15 a.m, and I left my house very quietly so my dad wouldn't find out. I turned on my phone and saw that I had received a message from her, in which she explained that I had to follow a particular stream until I found a part of the fence that was broken, and that was where I was supposed to enter. I was nervous and a bit scared about the date, but despite the feelings, I also felt quite confident and excited to meet Joanna. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more that confidence crumbled. The place looked desolate and spooky, and I kept asking myself what the hell was I getting into. I moved forward until I reached the stream she mentioned. My skin at this point was crawling, and it was genuinely very cold out. I followed the stream until I found an area with a broken wire, which I assumed was the place she meant. I entered, but just as I took a few steps, I immediately grabbed my phone and sent her a message telling her that I was there. At that moment, I heard the sound of a nearby phone. She replied, "I see you." It was getting a bit too creepy for me. How could she see me? It was all pitch black. What was I gonna do? What was gonna happen? These were some of the questions that were running through my head, and suddenly I started to hear footsteps on the grass as if someone was approaching. Then I heard a hello from afar, but that voice somehow told me things were going to end badly. It was somewhat distinctive. It seemed to be getting closer to me, and from the distance she said, "Please turn that off. I have a surprise for you, but I want to show you something, no cheating." Despite my doubts, I ended up turning it off. I need to emphasize that my phone in particular turns the flashlight on and off by shaking it, so I shook my phone and it switched off. I pocketed it and continued waiting. Then I heard the steps get closer until they were just feet away, but I still couldn't see anything. "What are you doing, Joaquin? You took a while." I didn't reply. I was too nervous. She came closer and grabbed my hand. "Come on, I want to show you what I promised." Her hand was strange. It felt very padded and cold. The hairs on her arms were thick, prickling my skin, and we started to walk in a straight line. But with every step, my fear intensified. We had walked quite a bit without exchanging a single word. Maybe it was only a minute, but in my head it felt like hours. Eventually, I stopped walking and asked her, "What are we doing? Where do you want to go?" That's when I heard other footsteps. They weren't ours. They were a bit further away. It was at that moment my nerves skyrocketed, and my heart seemed to want to jump up my chest. "It's okay, Joaquin, we're just walking." Then I grabbed my phone and shook it, turning on the flash, and I started shining it everywhere. I was terrified. This person wasn't a 23-year-old girl, but a woman of around 50, wearing a black and red dress. Her face looked evil, with hatred plastered all over it. But that's not all. As nervous as I was shining the flashlight everywhere, and from afar I could see other people. They were wearing dark clothes too, so all I could really make out were their heads. Then, in the distance, a very bright light shone, and at the same time, a heartbreaking scream of pain was heard. I turned around and could barely notice that in the distance there was a group of these people gathered around a cross where it appeared a person was nailed, and they had started to set it on fire. At that point, Joanna grabbed me tightly by the hand and tried to pull me towards there. I think it goes without saying that everything was clearly a setup. The woman had posed as someone my age to deceive me, and who knows, probably to kill me or use me in a ritual. They were definitely a cult. My parents always taught me to never lay a finger on women, but at that moment, that went out the window. I wasn't going to die there, and since struggling didn't help me break free from her grasp, I punched her directly in the face. I didn't hesitate, and started running, trying to find the way I'd came. I don't think they followed me, or I ran too fast because I reached a fence, jumped over it and just kept on running, until I saw a light. It was a house with its lights on and people inside. I ran towards them and they looked worried. When I told them what happened, they told me I shouldn't wander around there at night, because strange things have been known to happen out there. I was trembling and in shock. I called my parents, who arrived some 15 minutes later, and for days I looked for that woman's profile, but her contact had disappeared, and her number was marked as non-existent. On Tinder, her profile had completely vanished. Be wary who you meet online. Try to always meet first in a public place, as you never know what people's intentions truly are. I was going through a devastating depression after finding out that the woman I had been with for 4 years was cheating on me with someone from her work. It hurt to face the reality that my hopes and dreams had abruptly vanished. I tried to keep my mind occupied with work to avoid thinking about what could have been. Dealing with destructive thoughts was a challenge, and after work I drowned my sorrows in alcohol in an attempt to forget the wounds that the woman had inflicted upon me. Thus my days passed in my role as a police officer, patrolling a wealthy neighborhood and questioning why that woman had betrayed me in that way. Upon learning about my situation, my colleagues tried to cheer me up and occasionally introduced me to some of their friends. However, at the time, I had no desire to meet anyone else. I felt humiliated and devoid of the will to live. One night, my patrol partner and I stopped to have dinner near a convenience store, and it was there that the laughter of a girl in the store uniform caught my attention. So I turned around, and there I saw Pearl. I don't want to go into too much detail, but after a few months, Pearl and I became a couple, and we married 2 years later. I always asked her to quit her job, but she was never keen on the idea, so she continued to work at the same store near the restaurant where I used to eat at with my partner. Pearl daily would send me 2 messages, when she left home to go to work and when she got there, because I would always pick her up after her shift, so it was always just those 2. But one afternoon, the message that she'd arrived at work never came, which made me anxious. My partner tried to calm me down, suggesting that she just forgot, or maybe her phone had run out of battery. When I had the chance during patrol, I deviated from our route to go to the store, thinking that if her phone had died, she would be at the store, and I would be happy and carry on my way to work. But if that were the case, I wouldn't be sharing this story with you now. Because when I arrived, I was informed that she had not come into work that day. That is when my heart sank into my stomach. I called her parents. They knew nothing. I couldn't continue with my shift. I went to her parents' house, and from there I began calling our mutual friends and off-duty police officers to help me start a search. I informed my boss, but I knew perfectly well that they couldn't prioritize my situation. The matter was that the state governor belonged to a different political party than the city mayor, so the governor's people were closely watching us, waiting for an opportunity to make the mayor look bad. Therefore, the mayor had spoken with the police chief and said that if anyone in the department found themselves in the unfortunate need to request support for anything, it could be provided as long as there were no more important issues at the time. I filed a report, but we had to wait at least 8 hours to receive official support from my colleagues at the department. It was during those 8 hours that my colleagues, who were off duty or got away from their tasks, helped me look for Pearl. We talked to the neighbors, visited hospitals in our city and the surrounding one, but no dice. After the 8 hours had passed and the search officially began, with calls to police departments in other cities, alerts to the Attorney General's office and the federal police, I knew with every passing minute that something was terribly wrong, and my anxiety and desperation were just intensifying. In the first 24 hours, we confirmed that she wasn't in any hospitals in the 4 closest cities, nor in any morgue. Then a call came to Pearl's parents' house. The caller said he had seen a young woman similar to Pearl's features being taken. They were walking when a vehicle blocked their path. 2 men got out, grabbed her by the neck, and flung her in, saying it was a grey SUV with 2 doors and a large trunk. The last thing they said before hanging up was the direction the SUV went in. They said it took a street that connects the highway leading to the eastern part of the city, which is less urbanized. You know, unpaved streets, fewer traffic lights. Just like that. But unlike what you might imagine, It wasn't somewhere known for its criminal presence. That's why I found it strange. This call came at around 1 a.m, and Pearl's parents immediately called me, and since it was late and I didn't want to bother my boss, what I did was notify my colleagues who I knew would back me up. So the 6 of us agreed to meet at a local convenience store by the highway, and we went in a caravan to the neighborhood. Obviously not in our patrol cars, but our personal vehicles. We had just entered one of those neighborhoods when a grey SUV with 2 doors and a large trunk sped past us very quickly. Given its speed and time of night, we decided to follow it. We didn't get too close, simply speeding up enough to keep up with its taillights in view, maintaining a distance of around 200 yards. When we noticed the vehicle starting to slow down, we kept our speed and overtook it, but it was intentional. If the SUV was slowing down, it was because it was about to turn, which didn't lead to a neighborhood at all, but a dirt road cutting through an undeveloped terrain area. By the time we arrived, the SUV had moved further down the dirt road, but we weren't worried because the terrain was rough, so the SUV would have to move slowly. We left 5 cars halfway, and the 6 of us got into a single vehicle and followed the dirt road with the lights off. For the first few yards, we had to speed up a bit to catch up to it, without getting too close, just keeping its taillights in view. The SUV entered what seemed to be a kind of estate, and we stopped around 300 yards from it, got out, and went to check on foot. What we did was start walking around the walls that surrounded the estate, looking for any gap, even a small one, to peek inside, but we didn't find anything all the way around. Obviously, we couldn't just look through the gate, so someone suggested we climb to see what we could see from a distance. We found a tall tree, and one of our guys climbed up. He was there for no more than 30 seconds when he told us something strange was happening. There were men dressed in robes, and there was a large bonfire, and there were girls tied up around it with their faces covered, and that there were at least 9 people with long guns. We had weapons, but they were pistols, and if we tried anything, we knew we would end up dead. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't even know if Pearl was amongst the girls inside the estate, but if there was even the slightest possibility, I had to take it. We all went back to the car. My colleague made a call to some higher-ups, and 20 minutes later, a SWAT team arrived. We explained the situation and busted in. Using a truck, they knocked down the estate's gate, followed by another 2 trucks. There were a lot of gunshots, but the whole thing lasted less than 5 minutes. One of them signaled us and we ran over there, especially me, heading straight for where the girls were. But before I could reach them, 2 of their men stopped me and said, "Look, you don't want to see this. Tell us what your girl looks like. We've seen them all." When they said that, my blood ran cold, because I realized the girls were already dead. My colleague caught up to me and saw how nervous I was. They asked me what was going on, and the leader of those guys came over and said they would let me see. And yes, there was Pearl, in the same condition as the other guys. She had been suffocated, with hand marks around her neck, her eyes open, but it looked like she had fought until her last breath. It's not really a consolation, but it was nice to know. They had defended themselves with all their strength. The victims all had burn marks on their feet. Apparently they had been made to walk on something hot. Their hair had been cut. I vomited from the shock. I was devastated and fell to the ground crying. Then, from under a car on the estate, they dragged out a man who was hiding. They were about to shoot him when he was ordered to come over and was asked to reveal what the hell had happened here. He never used the word cult or sect. He just said there were a group of people gathered to hold masses in honor of their god. But regardless of his denial, that's obvious what they were: a cult. The man continued talking, mentioning that the estate was used for not only their strange masses, but other activities I can't detail here. Then he revealed that it wasn't just them, and that they had allies in high places. Not sure what he meant by that, but it sounded like he was implying they were connected with influential people. I was consumed with rage. I wanted to take his life, but I was stopped. They needed him alive. I had to restrain myself. Honestly, I'm very grateful because although I couldn't save Pearl, I was able to at least recover her body and give her a proper burial. This all started when a close friend of mine began exhibiting very odd behavior. Although he'd always been a good friend, something was dramatically changing in him. Intrigued and concerned, I asked him to try and understand what was going on. It was during that conversation that he revealed he was involved in a cult, which explained his behavior and his lack of sleep due to the frequent meetings that happened in the early hours. As my friend shared more details about the cult's activities, my curiosity grew. He suggested the possibility of joining to experience everything for myself. And being quite curious, I accepted the offer, without fully understanding the hole I was getting myself into. My friend asked if I was sure, and I said I was. He then took his phone and called someone from the cult to ask if he could bring a potential member. After exchanging a few words, he told me there would be a meeting the following night for them to see me and make a decision. That night, we headed out to a place outside the city. Imagine we were on the road left of the city, and before reaching the next, there, in the middle of nowhere, we took a dirt road and traveled a while until reaching a place that left me astonished. It was what appeared to be a giant sanctuary, more ostentatious than the city's cathedral. I entered and was met with images of demons, names like Beelzebub and Lucifer adorned the walls. I was taken to a room where I underwent what seemed to be an intense interrogation, questions about my reasons for joining, if I was already in another cult, and if I was a devotee of death. I answered honestly, explaining that my only motive was curiosity, and after the extensive interrogation I left the room, and my friend continued to show me around. It was a somber, imposing and disconcerting environment. The members gathered again and communicated that I would be accepted into the community, or as they preferred to call it, the church, but obviously it was a cult. It wasn't before long that vehicles of all kinds began arriving. Vans, cars, a limo. It was a strange sight. I was expecting to see people in black hoods and scenes worthy of a movie, but it was nothing like that. These were just regular people coming to participate in the event. We had dinner, and at the end, my friend took me back home and told me there would be another meeting in 2 days. Over the months, my friend explained to me about the internal structure and activities. I discovered there were different ranks and that practices were divided by stages. Throughout the years I attended that place, I witnessed and lived experiences that I consider unbearable for many. To avoid dragging on too long, I'll start with rituals that we might consider mild, such as animal sacrifices. I won't go into the specific details, as they were quite strange, but there were sacrifices of chickens and goats and other animals as part of the activities we carried out. One of the questions I asked myself within the sect was the reason for such sacrifices, to which I was informed that each entity had its own form of worship. Some required sacrifices, others just demanded blood, and some others accepted more common offerings like money. For example, there was a figure of Santa Muerte, associated with abundance and the absence of evil, where people usually left money as an offering. And over the years I gradually moved up in level. Each year I learned new practices and rituals. The cult had values that indeed differed from many commandments of the more conventional churches. Throughout my journey I met masters who, unlike leaders, were tasked with teaching and guiding. On one occasion, around 5 or 6 members, including myself, had an option presented to undergo certain intensive rituals for a year and a half to prepare for what they called the Great Revelation. We all said yes, of course. The process was very intense, and I'm not proud of what I'm about to say, but I participated in a human sacrifice. It wasn't pleasant. The year and a half passed, and they told us that we were taken to the very important ceremony that which we'd been preparing. We went to the furthest part of the temple, one in which I'd never been. Upon entering, we found a room. It was kind of a trapdoor in the floor that led to stairs taking us down to a cave. After walking for a small while, we arrived at what seemed to be an arch, 2 wooden pillars joined by bones at the top. There were no doors, which I found odd, because I would understand placing such decorations on a door, but just standing there was a bit odd. There was no visible difference between being on one side or the other. It was a cave. The only thing on both sides was rock. We reached the arch and were given special robes with a symbol on, and then crossed underneath. As we continued walking, one of the people guiding us clarified that upon reaching my designated place, we were absolutely prohibited from speaking and could not make any noise with our mouths. When we reached the end of the cave, there was an old worn-out chair, and around it were things that screamed atrocities. Children's clothes and other details that I wish I had never seen. And behind the chair, carved into the rock, was the Star of David. We were told the fact that we were there indicated that we understood the purpose of that chair, and that if we wanted to take the next step, we had to commit to procuring a sacrifice each year. It was at that moment, disgusted, that I wanted to run away. I knew perfectly well what happened to people who left the sect, and yes, those who hadn't seen what I had seen ended very badly. I didn't even want to imagine what they would do to me if I said I didn't want to continue. Easy sacrifice, I suppose. So, like everyone else, I committed to fulfilling what they were asking, and to formalize the commitment, we made a small blood pact, and then began our journey back. Upon exiting the cave and arriving at the main hall of the temple, that is, the dining room, the highest-ranking members of the cult were waiting for us. They congratulated us, we had dinner, and everyone went home. Seeing what I saw left me unable to sleep for around 3 days, until I just passed out from exhaustion. I couldn't accept what had happened, and I was determined to distance myself from the cult. But I didn't know how. I knew I couldn't abruptly leave, but what I could do was find a way out to gradually distance myself in a friendly manner and without raising suspicion. What I had to do was find a way for my job to transfer me, and then I spoke to the cult to tell them I would be moving and working in another state. In this way, I wasn't running away. Keep in mind that even being far from the cult, I had to continue attending the temple for over a year. But what I did was space out the time between visits, until I just stopped going back altogether. There was no reprisal against me because I didn't leave abruptly but gradually, so it didn't seem like I was trying to flee. I suspect that's why I'm still alive. It's assumed that I'm still a part of the sect because I never officially left. I just haven't met up with them for the past 8 years. And honestly, I think it's better that way. A few years ago, my family made the decision to admit me to a rehabilitation center due to problems with alcohol and other substances. My relatives made this decision because I had become uncontrollable. I had hit rock bottom several times, showing no intention of changing and moving forward with my life. I really wish I could tell you where this happened, but as you'll soon find out, I can't reveal the details. I can say that the center was in an old mansion on the outskirts of a city located on one of the several roads leading out of the state of Mexico. From the beginning, I noticed strange behavior among the patients and staff at the center. For example, at night you could hear several people walking through the hallways while murmuring. I understand that in a place of that nature, one must always be alert, especially at night, because the inmates could come up with anything. But having one person for every 2 rooms was enough, because the door was locked from the outside, so no inmate could leave their room during the night, which made it so strange to hear such movement in the hallway. Furthermore, once a month, very strange noises could be heard coming from an area off the center that no inmate could access. These noises lasted between 2:30 to 3:30. At first, it was extremely difficult for me to identify and differentiate the sounds because they were very far away, but it was like a mix of chanting, music, and I could even hear muffled screams. You know, like if someone's mouth was covered while they screamed. Obviously, the first few times I noticed strange things, I asked the center staff, but they always gave me ambiguous answers or simply did not respond, which is why I stopped asking. Another odd thing was that the inmates with the most severe cases, that is, those whose addictions were so strong that they ended up in the center to avoid jail, almost had no family, and those who did could not return to their families because they had exhausted them. So it could be said that those who were worse off had no life outside the center. Well, they had a kind of scar on their left wrist. It looked like a mark made by a razor blade, shaped like a small triangle with a dot in the middle. The fact that I had certain problems with addiction did not impede me from thinking clearly. It was obvious that it was too unlikely for all of them to have known each other before entering, and that for some reason they had made that mark on themselves. The most logical explanation was that they had done so inside the center. I tried to ask them about the marks, but the questions were always evaded, as if ashamed, or that it meant something bad. And so these little odd details that theoretically were not connected began to make me feel somewhat paranoid. My situation and behavior began to draw the attention of the center's staff, and their attitude towards me gradually started to change, to the point where I felt they were treating me with hostility. The moment I began to feel attacked was when the food they gave me had a strange taste. Not excessively, but I noticed it. It wasn't that it tasted bad, but it had a certain je ne sais quoi, a flavor that didn't belong there, and it happened with the juices and smoothies. The situation became unbearable when on one occasion I lost consciousness after drinking a juice. When I woke up, I found myself in a room in only my underwear. I was just starting to react when people wearing plastic animal masks entered. Being surrounded by masked individuals was the most terrifying moment of my life. I honestly thought they were going to do something horrible, especially because I was in underwear. But nothing did happen. What they did was hold me down and with a razor blade made the same symbol on me that I had seen on the other inmates, the triangle with a dot. After that, they sat me in front of a chair and a TV and tied me up so that I wouldn't look away from the screen, and began to play a series of impactful recordings. I don't mean what was shown was something very strong. The man, in fact, was only looking directly at the screen. The important thing was what the man said, because everything was done in such a way that it seemed like this person was talking directly to me. I guess the people at the center had everything well studied as to know how to hit low blows in the mind. I also guess they had different recordings for different types of people, because I don't believe the words that the man in the recording was saying would have had the same effect on someone with a very different life to mine. That recording broke me. It attacked my psyche, my behavior, my way of thinking, and it made me feel that everything bad that had happened to me was my fault, and that my life was a mess because I was a mess. I was looking at that screen for more than 12 hours, and I felt something inside my mind break. Every word that man said penetrated deeply into my brain. I guess that was the idea. They wanted to break me. And after that, they released me, gave me clothes, fed me, and let me sleep in my room. The next day, I didn't want to leave my room at all because I felt vulnerable. But in the early hours, they forcibly took me out and dragged me back to the room again. I couldn't scream because they covered my mouth, and as they dragged me, they tore my clothes until I was only in my underwear. They tied me to the same chair and replayed all the recordings, and so they kept me for 6 weeks. I don't remember much of what happened during that time because they were breaking my mind. In fact, the only reason I know it was 6 weeks was because every time they took me back to my room after being tied to that chair, I would make a mark on the wall to count the times they took me. In total, they took me 21 times in 6 weeks. During that month and a half, I witnessed many things that I gradually remembered. The point is, after, something happened. There was a fire in the kitchen. The flames spread quickly, devouring the facilities. Of course, both I and many of the inmates knew that this was the perfect opportunity to escape from that hell. Instead of trying to control the fire or help others get out, several of us made our way through the fire to get out of there. Since most of the staff were at the front, we escaped through the back. So when we got out of the center, we didn't head towards the road, but towards the mountain. Of course, the most logical thing would have been, since we were outside, to simply go around the building and run towards the road. But none of us were thinking clearly at that moment. So we ran and went deep into the mountain. The mountain led us to a hill. In all that chaos, we separated. I don't know what happened to the others, but I hid in a ditch I found on the way because I didn't want to climb the hill. I stayed there hidden in the ditch until the sun set, and at dusk I walked to the other side of the mountain and luckily found the road. I stayed at the side of the road until I flagged down a car and a couple stopped and offered their help. They didn't ask questions, as if they realized I was in a bad state, and the last thing I needed was to talk about what happened. I asked them to please take me to my family's house. It wasn't actually that far, and they did. When I made it back, I told them what they'd done to me. Well, what little I remembered, but of course they didn't believe me. My family believed what was reported on the local news. The news said that several of the inmates had organized to set the place on fire. But the truth is, I don't care whether they believe me or not. The only important thing was that the place was completely destroyed, and therefore I no longer had to return. But the nightmare didn't end there, because as the days went by, I began to remember some of the things that happened during the 6 weeks I was subjected to the brainwashing. The memories I have and scenes are without much context. That is, just fragments. To give you an idea, imagine you're watching the trailer of a movie that has many disconnected sequences that weren't necessarily in order and lacked context, but I was still able to reconstruct some of what happened. What I can assure you is the rehabilitation center was just a facade for a cult, with significant influence to carry out their tumultuous activities. As you can imagine, there were certain types of sacrifices, but the members of the cult never dirtied their hands with blood. They needed scapegoats to do the work for them. That's where the symbol of the triangle with a dot in the center becomes relevant. Within the cult, that symbol signifies something like permission to corrupt the laws of nature, meaning that those who have the symbol marked on their skin are allowed to kill. So, what they did was choose people just as they chose me, broke our minds, and left us so damaged that they could manipulate us to the point that we would obey without question. I don't understand much about the subject, but I'm sure that being in underwear while we were subjected to brainwashing was to make me feel defenseless and make it easier to break me. Now I understand why those who had the mark refused to talk about it. They must have endured horrible things without being able to resist, because their will was ashes. I remember some of the things those people forced me to do. I pulled teeth from more than one person without anesthesia, forcibly removed nails, broke noses, and other things I'd rather not mention. The person I did that to did not perish during the process, because in those sect sections there was a doctor in charge of keeping them alive, so that they could have a bigger show. I guess all the victims were people who were kidnapped, or homeless, people who were sex workers, orphans, I don't know. The important part is I did terrible things to them, and I know that even though I don't intend to do it, even though I was forced, I know that I did it, and that God will punish me for it, because every time I have a nightmare, I see myself in hell. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope to see you in our next ritual very soon. A huge thank you as always to everyone who participated in tonight's ritual. Your names have been immortalized on screen forever. And if you need to fill your night with more horrors, links can be seen on screen now. Stay safe until next time.